At 2:18 in the morning on November 23, 2022, a phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a location pin. Just coordinates, no words, no explanation. The person who sent it was 22 years old, a college student, someone who always added context to her messages, someone who never sent pins without saying why. Her mother would see that message hours later and feel something shift in her chest. Because mothers know. They know when something is wrong, even when the words say everything is fine. That pin would become the most important message Jasmine Pace ever sent. By the time her family understood what it meant, she had already been gone for hours, and the person responsible was someone she trusted, someone she met on a dating app, someone who was at that very moment trying to erase every trace of what he had done. This is the story of Jasmine Pace, a story of a Thanksgiving that never happened, a family that refused to stop searching, and a single location pin that would expose a brutal truth. Jasmine Antoinette Pace, her family called her Jazzy, grew up knowing what it meant to survive. Her childhood wasn't easy. There were years marked by instability, times when she ran away from home, nights spent without a roof over her head. But Jasmine also knew how to rebuild. By the time she reached her early 20s, she had turned her life around in ways that would have seemed impossible during those darkest years. She enrolled at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, started taking classes seriously, and began to see a future she could actually reach for. Education became her pathway out. Every class she attended, every assignment she completed, every test she passed, represented another step away from the instability of her past and toward the stability she desperately wanted for her future. Her relationship with her mother, Katrina, was complicated the way most mother-daughter relationships are when both people have been through hardship together. They had weathered storms that would have broken many families. They clashed sometimes. They didn't always see eye to eye. There were periods when the distance between them felt unbridgeable, when old wounds and painful memories made connection difficult. But after Jasmine's grandmother died, something fundamental shifted between them. The loss reminded them both that time with the people you love isn't guaranteed. Death has a way of putting everything else into perspective, of making petty disagreements seem insignificant, of highlighting what really matters. They started texting more after the funeral. The messages were small at first, checking in, sharing little updates about their days, sending each other random thoughts and memories. Then they started calling more frequently. The conversations grew longer. They began making plans to spend real time together. Not just obligatory holiday gatherings, but genuine quality time. The distance that had built up between them over the years started to close, one conversation at a time, one shared memory at a time, one laugh at a time. They were rebuilding their relationship, and both of them could feel it happening. Jasmine was the kind of person who carried her emotions on her sleeve. When she loved someone, they knew it without a shadow of doubt. When she was angry, they felt it from across the room. She didn't hide who she was or pretend to be someone she wasn't to make other people comfortable. That authenticity, that refusal to wear masks, was both her strength and sometimes her vulnerability. Friends described her as loyal to a fault, the type of person who would drop everything at 3 in the morning if someone she cared about needed her. She was protective of the people in her circle, fiercely so, and she expected that same loyalty in return. Thanksgiving 2022 was supposed to be a milestone in that journey. A moment of reconnection, a chance to sit down as a family, share a meal, and celebrate how far they had all come. Katrina was looking forward to it with an anticipation she hadn't felt in years. She had been cooking for days, planning the menu, making sure everything would be perfect. She wanted this Thanksgiving to be special. She wanted it to be memorable for the right reasons. Jasmine had promised she would be there. She had committed to the holiday in a way she hadn't always done in previous years. The holiday carried extra weight that year because of the grief they were still processing from losing Jasmine's grandmother. This Thanksgiving was supposed to be healing. It was supposed to bring them closer together. It was supposed to mark a new chapter in their family story. But Jasmine never made it to Thanksgiving dinner. The meal Katrina prepared went uneaten. The plans they had made dissolved into confusion, and then panic, and then horror. On the night of November 22nd, just before midnight, Jasmine left her family's home. She walked out the front door at 11:30 p.m., wearing casual clothes, nothing that suggested she was planning anything unusual. She was carrying her phone and the keys to her white Chevy Equinox. She didn't tell anyone exactly where she was going. She didn't say when she'd be back. She didn't leave a note or send a text explaining her plans. Her family assumed she was going to see a friend, maybe clear her head, do what young people do when they need space and solitude. Jasmine had a history of stepping away when life felt overwhelming. It was her way of processing things, of finding air when the walls felt too close. She would drive around the city sometimes, just thinking, listening to music, giving herself space to sort through whatever was bothering her. Her family understood this pattern. They had seen it before. So when she left that night, no one panicked. Not yet. They assumed she would come back in a few hours, or maybe crash at a friend's place and return in the morning. It seemed routine. It seemed normal. The house settled into quiet after she left. Katrina went to bed around 1 in the morning, assuming she'd hear from Jasmine by breakfast. Travis did the same. The night passed slowly, the way nights do when you're waiting for something without realizing you're waiting. The hours ticked by. Midnight became 1 a.m., then 2, then 3, then 4. The darkness outside gradually gave way to the gray light of early morning, and as the sun started to rise on November 23rd, Katrina's phone stayed quiet. No call, no text, no word from her daughter. By mid-morning, Katrina was checking her phone every few minutes. Still nothing. She tried to push down the worry, telling herself that Jasmine was probably sleeping in somewhere, that she'd wake up and call soon. But as the hours continued to pass, that worry grew harder to ignore, and then finally, around late morning, a message came through. It was from Jasmine's phone. The text said she was staying with a friend and that she was fine. Katrina read the message and felt a knot form in her stomach. Something about it felt wrong immediately. The phrasing didn't sound like Jasmine. Her daughter didn't text like that. The message was too short, too vague, too dismissive. Jasmine knew how much her mother worried. She knew that disappearing overnight without proper explanation would cause concern. If she really was just staying with a friend, she would have called, not texted. She would have explained where she was and who she was with. She would have had a conversation, not sent a single line that raised more questions than it answered. Katrina tried calling. The phone rang and rang. No answer. She called again. Still nothing. And then, in the early afternoon, another message appeared, this time on Facebook. A photo of Jasmine had been posted to her account, a throwback picture from years earlier. Katrina stared at the image on her screen, and her worry transformed into something closer to alarm. She recognized that photo immediately. It was old. It was from a completely different period of Jasmine's life. Her daughter didn't look like that anymore. Her hair was different, longer in the photo than it was now. Her style had changed significantly. And most noticeably, most glaringly, her tattoos weren't visible in the picture. Jasmine had gotten several tattoos over the past few years, pieces of art on her arms and body that she was proud of, that she showed off regularly in her social media posts. They were part of how she expressed herself, part of her identity. She posted recent photos constantly. She wasn't the type of person to dig through old pictures and post nostalgia content without any context, and she certainly wouldn't post a photo that didn't show her tattoos unless there was a very specific reason. The caption on the post felt equally wrong. It was generic, bland, the kind of thing a stranger might write if they were trying to sound like someone they didn't really know. It didn't have Jasmine's voice. It didn't have her personality. It didn't sound like her at all. Katrina's hands started shaking as she read it again and again, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She took a screenshot and sent it to other family members. Did this seem strange to them? Did this sound like Jasmine? The responses came back quickly, and they all said the same thing. No, None of it felt right. Jasmine's aunt tried calling her immediately. No answer. Friends reached out, some of them joking at first, asking what was up with the random old photo, then becoming more concerned when Jasmine didn't reply to any of them. The only communication coming from Jasmine's phone were those strange, short texts that didn't sound like her. And Katrina noticed something else, something that made her blood run cold. There were no phone calls, no voice notes, no video chats, no FaceTime. Jasmine used video chat constantly. She sent voice messages all the time because she hated typing out long explanations. But now, suddenly, whoever was responding from her phone was only willing to type. They didn't want to be heard or seen. They were hiding behind text messages, maintaining distance, staying in control of what was being communicated. By the afternoon of November 23rd, the Pace family knew beyond any doubt that something was seriously wrong. This wasn't Jasmine being irresponsible or flaky. This wasn't her staying out longer than planned and forgetting to check in. This was something else, something dangerous. After a while, Katrina and her husband Travis called the Chattanooga Police Department and filed a missing person report. They explained everything in detail. The strange texts that didn't sound like their daughter, the old Facebook photo that made no sense, the complete refusal to answer phone calls, the total deviation from Jasmine's normal communication patterns. The response they got was frustrating in the way that law enforcement responses to missing adults often are. Jasmine was 22 years old, legally an adult with full autonomy over her own movements. She had the right to go where she wanted without checking in with her parents. Unless there was clear evidence of foul play, unless there were signs of a struggle or specific threats, the police couldn't treat this as an emergency. The officer taking the report was polite, but firm. They would log the information. They would keep it on file. But they couldn't launch an immediate search for an adult who might have simply decided to spend time away from home. Katrina tried to explain that this was completely out of character, that the texts were clearly not written by Jasmine, that something was obviously very wrong, but the legal reality remained unchanged. They took the report. They logged the information. They made notes about the family's concerns. But they didn't deploy search teams or issue alerts or treat it as an urgent case. The Paces left the police station feeling frustrated and powerless, knowing that their daughter was in danger but unable to make anyone in authority take it as seriously as they knew it deserved. So the Pace family did what they had to do. They became investigators themselves. They weren't going to sit at home waiting for official channels to move at their own bureaucratic pace while their daughter's life hung in the balance. They started making calls. They reached out to every friend of Jasmine's they could think of, asking if anyone had seen her, if anyone knew where she might be, if anyone had actually received a phone call from her rather than just text messages. They drove around to places Jasmine frequented, coffee shops she liked, restaurants she visited, stores she shopped at, showing people her photo, asking if anyone had seen her in the past 24 hours. Back at home later that evening, Katrina went through every detail she could remember, replaying the day's events in her mind, searching for clues she might have missed. She scrolled through her text message history with Jasmine, reading and rereading their recent conversations, looking for anything that might indicate where she had gone or who she had been planning to see. She looked at Jasmine's social media accounts, checking tagged photos, comments, recent posts, anything that might provide a lead. And then she saw it. Something she had noticed earlier in the day, but hadn't fully processed in the chaos of everything else. The location pin, sent at 2:18 a.m. on November 23rd, a pin marking a specific address, 110 Tremont Street, apartment 210. No message attached. No explanation. No context. Just coordinates dropped into their text conversation in the middle of the night, sitting there between the last normal message Jasmine had sent and the first strange message that had come hours later. Katrina stared at that pin, and suddenly everything clicked into focus. Jasmine never sent location pins like this. Never. She was meticulous about communication. If she sent you her location, she would always add context. I'm here waiting for you, or meet me at this place, or this is where the party is. She gave explanations, She provided details. She made sure people understood why she was sharing her location. But this pin had been sent alone, in the dead of night, with absolutely no words attached. And the timestamp. 2:18 a.m. That was shortly after she had left the house, shortly before the strange texts had started coming through. Katrina's hands started shaking as the implications became clear. Jasmine had been trying to tell her where she was. This wasn't a casual sharing of location. This was a message sent in desperation, in danger, in a moment when Jasmine couldn't or wouldn't type out words, but could send coordinates. This was her daughter's way of leaving a trail when she couldn't speak freely, when someone might be watching, when she needed to communicate something crucial without alerting whoever was nearby. Katrina called Travis immediately. She showed him the pin. They pulled up the address on their phone, 110 Tremont Street, an apartment complex near downtown Chattanooga. Neither of them had ever heard Jasmine mention that address. They didn't know anyone who lived there. But that pin had come from Jasmine's phone at 2:18 in the morning, and that meant something. That meant everything. They went to 110 Tremont Street immediately, his hands gripping the steering wheel tight, his foot heavy on the accelerator. The building was a multi-story apartment complex, older but well-maintained, with outdoor walkways and numbered units visible from the parking lot. They found apartment 210 on the second floor and practically ran up the stairs. Travis knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, harder, the sound echoing through the hallway. Still nothing. Where are you watching from? Drop your locations in the comments. If you've made it this far, let me know by commenting, "Still here." Let's see who's been paying attention from the very beginning. They knocked a third time, and Katrina called out that they were looking for their daughter, that they just wanted to make sure she was okay, that they weren't going to leave until someone answered. Nothing. The door stayed closed. No sound came from inside. No movement. No indication that anyone was home or willing to acknowledge their presence. The silence felt ominous, heavy with implication. They went downstairs and found the building manager, a middle-aged man who listened to their story with growing concern. He was hesitant at first, bound by rules about tenant privacy and not wanting to violate someone's rights without proper cause. But after hearing the full story, the missing person report, the strange texts, the location pin sent at 2:18 in the morning, the family's absolute certainty that something was wrong, he checked his records and confirmed that apartment 210 was rented to a young man named Jason Chen. That name meant nothing to Katrina. She had never heard Jasmine mention anyone named Jason. She didn't know who this person was or what connection he had to her daughter, but she felt certain, with every maternal instinct she possessed, that whatever happened to Jasmine had happened inside that apartment. She could feel it. She knew it the way you know things in your bones without being able to explain exactly how you know them. The Paces contacted the police again from the parking lot of the apartment complex. This time they had more to offer than just worried parent intuition. They had the location pin sent at 2:18 a.m. They had the specific address. They had the apartment number. They had the name of the tenant. They explained all of this to the dispatcher, stressing the urgency, begging for someone to come check on the apartment and make sure Jasmine wasn't in danger inside. Officers arrived within the hour. They listened to the family's concerns, reviewed the information they had gathered, and agreed that the situation warranted investigation, but they still needed more to obtain a search warrant. They couldn't just break into someone's apartment based on a location pin and a family's worry, no matter how justified that worry seemed. The officers tried making contact with the apartment's occupant, knocking on the door, calling out, asking if anyone was home. No response. They checked with neighbors, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual in the past 24 hours. Most people said no, but one neighbor mentioned hearing what might have been screaming in the early morning hours, but hadn't thought much of it at the time. As the afternoon wore on and the accumulating details painted an increasingly concerning picture, the officers began the process of obtaining a search warrant. The combination of factors, the missing person report, the location pin sent in the middle of the night, the complete lack of response from the apartment, the neighbor's statement about possible screaming, gave them enough probable cause to request judicial approval for entry. By late evening on November 23rd, with the warrant approved and the family's concerns thoroughly documented, police and the property manager prepared to enter apartment 210. The Paces stood in the parking lot below, watching officers and investigators gather, watching equipment being carried up the stairs. They held on to each other as the door to apartment 210 was unlocked and opened. When officers stepped inside, what they found confirmed the family's worst fears and validated every instinct Katrina had experienced throughout the day. Jasmine's travel bag sat near the entrance, positioned as though someone had set it down intending to pick it back up. Inside the bag were her essential items: her identification, her credit cards, her phone charger, her wallet with cash still inside. Everything Jasmine would need if she were going anywhere. Everything that proved she hadn't left this apartment voluntarily. But Jasmine herself was nowhere to be seen. The apartment smelled overwhelmingly of cleaning products. Not the faint, pleasant scent of routine tidying or regular housekeeping. This was the sharp chemical assault of industrial-strength cleaning supplies used in large quantities. The smell of bleach and ammonia hung so thick in the air it made eyes water. The floors looked recently mopped, still slightly damp in some areas. The counters in the kitchen gleamed unnaturally. Every surface appeared to have been scrubbed aggressively, obsessively. Everything was too clean. Suspiciously clean. The kind of clean that raises immediate red flags for anyone who has ever worked a crime scene. Travis spotted a notebook on the floor near the entrance, partially hidden under a small table. He pointed it out to the officers, who photographed it in place before picking it up. Inside, written in neat, careful handwriting, was personal information. A name, Jason Chen, along with addresses, phone numbers, and various notes about school and work. This was his apartment. This was his notebook. Jasmine had been here. Her belongings proved that. But now she was gone, and all of her essential items remained behind, and the apartment reeked of someone trying to erase evidence of what had happened. Police secured the scene immediately, stretching yellow crime scene tape across the doorway, clearing the area of unauthorized personnel, establishing a perimeter. They called for crime scene investigators to come process the apartment thoroughly. Crime scene vans pulled up. Investigators carried cases of equipment up the stairs. Lights came on inside the apartment, bright and clinical. Katrina and Travis held each other in the darkness, watching those lights, knowing that their daughter had been in that apartment less than 24 hours ago, knowing that something terrible had happened to her there, knowing that they were watching the beginning of an investigation into her disappearance and possibly her death. Crime scene investigators arrived with their specialized equipment, including bottles of luminol, a chemical compound that reacts with the iron in blood to produce a blue glow under ultraviolet light. Luminol is remarkable because it can detect blood even after extensive cleaning. Even if someone scrubs a surface with bleach, even if no trace is visible to the naked eye, even if the blood has been diluted and dispersed, luminol will find the microscopic remnants and reveal them under UV examination. They began methodically spraying luminol across surfaces throughout the apartment, working from room to room, documenting everything with cameras and detailed notes. In the living room, they sprayed the hardwood floors. At first, nothing appeared. Then, when they switched on the UV lights, the floor began to glow. Not just a spot here or there. Patterns, streaks, large areas that lit up bright blue, showing where blood had been present in significant quantities before someone had mopped it away. The patterns told a story. Concentrated pools that had spread across the floor, drag marks suggesting movement of something heavy and bleeding, spatter patterns on the lower portions of walls, the kind created when blood is expelled with force, transfer patterns showing where bloody hands or objects had touched surfaces. The entire living room glowed under the UV light like a constellation map of violence. They moved to the walls. More blue luminescence appeared, concentrated near floor level, spreading up in places where someone had tried to wipe away evidence but hadn't succeeded completely. They checked the couch. The edges of the cushions lit up. They examined the kitchen. Spatter marks appeared on the lower cabinets, tiny droplets that had landed there during the attack and been wiped away but not completely erased. They processed the bedroom. Transfer marks glowed on the floor leading from the living room, showing the path someone had taken dragging or carrying something bleeding through the apartment. Despite the heavy cleaning, despite the overwhelming smell of chemicals, despite what must have been hours of scrubbing and mopping and wiping, traces of blood remained. Forensic science revealed what someone had desperately tried to hide. The apartment told its story whether its occupant wanted it to or not. Investigators found additional evidence as they processed the scene more thoroughly. A kitchen knife resting on the bed in the bedroom, lying on top of the covers as though someone had set it down there after using it. The blade was clean, wiped carefully, but its placement was suspicious and unusual. Why would someone keep a kitchen knife on their bed? Broken household items had been shoved into corners and behind furniture. A lamp with a shattered base, picture frames with cracked glass, other objects that suggested a violent struggle had taken place, and someone had tried to hide the evidence of that struggle, rather than simply throwing the broken items away. In the dumpsters outside the building, investigators recovered trash bags containing Jason Chen's clothing. Some items were stained with what preliminary testing suggested was blood. Also in the trash were paper towels, cleaning supplies, rubber gloves, all the materials someone would use to clean up after a violent crime. The dumpsters became evidence repositories, each bag carefully removed, cataloged, and secured for laboratory analysis. The apartment had been staged to look normal, or at least normal enough to pass a casual inspection. But under forensic examination, it revealed violence, extensive bleeding, a desperate cleanup attempt, and a clear effort to make evidence disappear. Someone had killed Jasmine Pace in this apartment. Someone had tried to clean up the scene to remove all traces of what they had done, and that someone was Jason Chen. If you're finding this story insightful, hit the like button and subscribe. Share this with people you care about so they can recognize the warning signs and protect themselves. Awareness can save lives. Katrina stood outside in the cold November night, her arms wrapped around herself against both the temperature and the horror of what was unfolding. She didn't need the investigators to come down and tell her what they had found. She already knew. She had known since she saw that location pin. She had known since she read those fake texts. She had known from the moment her maternal instincts started screaming that something was catastrophically wrong. Jasmine was in trouble, worse dead. Her daughter might have been killed inside that apartment by someone she had trusted enough to visit in the middle of the night. And the person who did it had tried to make it look like she had just run away. While forensic teams continued processing the crime scene at apartment 210, detectives began the painstaking work of pulling surveillance footage from cameras around the apartment complex and nearby businesses. Modern urban environments are saturated with cameras. Apartment buildings have them at entrances and exits. Parking lots have them monitoring vehicles. Stores have them watching their doors and registers. Traffic cameras capture movement at intersections. Gas stations record everyone who pulls in. All of these electronic eyes work silently in the background, recording everything, creating a digital timeline that can be reconstructed frame by frame to show exactly what happened and when. The timeline detectives pieced together from multiple camera sources was detailed and chilling. On November 22nd, at 11:52 p.m., Jasmine Pace arrived at 110 Tremont Street in her white Chevy Equinox. Surveillance footage from the parking lot camera showed her pulling into a visitor space, turning off the engine, and stepping out of the vehicle. She was alone, moving normally, not appearing distressed or afraid or coerced. She walked toward the building entrance carrying her phone and her travel bag. She entered the building and disappeared from camera view as she walked up to the second floor. At 2:11 a.m., a neighbor in an apartment adjacent to 210 reported hearing a woman screaming. The screams were loud, desperate, unmistakably distressed. They were the kind of sounds that wake you from deep sleep and make your heart race. But they lasted only a few moments before stopping abruptly, suddenly, in a way that was almost more disturbing than the screaming itself. The neighbor, groggy and disoriented, convinced themselves it might have been a television, or a nightmare, or a domestic argument that had resolved itself. They didn't immediately call the police. They went back to sleep, a decision that would haunt them forever once they learned what had actually happened. At 2:18 a.m., 7 minutes after the screaming stopped, Jasmine's phone sent the location pin to her mother. Investigators analyzing the phone records believe that in those final moments, as she was dying or had just been fatally wounded, Jasmine managed to access her phone and send her mother the coordinates showing where she was. It was a final act of incredible strength and presence of mind. Even as her life was ending, even as she must have been in unimaginable pain and fear, she was thinking clearly enough to leave evidence, to create a trail that would lead investigators to the truth, to make sure that her family would know what happened and where to look. Over the next several hours, surveillance cameras throughout the area captured Jason Chen's movements as he dealt with what he had done. Around 3:30 a.m., he was seen leaving his apartment building through a side exit, walking quickly to his car with his head down, and driving away. He returned approximately an hour later, parking in a different spot, entering the building through a different door. Around 6 a.m., as the sun was beginning to rise, cameras captured him dragging a large wheeled suitcase down the exterior stairs of the building. The suitcase appeared heavy based on how he moved with it. He had to stop twice on the stairs to readjust his grip. He leaned backward as he pulled it, using his body weight to counterbalance the load. He struggled to lift it into the trunk of a vehicle. These weren't the movements of someone casually moving luggage. These were the movements of someone transporting something heavy, awkward, and difficult to manage. Investigators would later realize they were watching Jason Chen remove Jasmine's body from his apartment. Throughout the morning of November 23rd, detectives tracked Jason's movements using a combination of surveillance cameras, cell phone records, and credit card transactions. He drove to a Walgreens at 7:22 a.m. and purchased cleaning supplies, industrial bleach, heavy-duty trash bags, paper towels, rubber gloves. Store cameras captured him at the register, paying with cash, avoiding eye contact with the cashier. He drove to a Walmart at 8:45 a.m. and bought additional supplies. More trash bags, more cleaning products, duct tape, rope. Again, cash transaction. Again, no eye contact. He was already in cover-up mode, already trying to minimize his digital footprint, already thinking about how to avoid leaving evidence. He took a rideshare back to his apartment at one point, and the driver later confirmed to police that he had picked up a young man matching Jason's description who seemed nervous and agitated, who didn't want to make conversation, who kept checking his phone obsessively during the short ride. Jason's own vehicle remained parked at various locations throughout the day as he moved around the city, managing the aftermath of what he had done. And throughout all of this, Jasmine's phone continued pinging cell towers, showing movement across Chattanooga. But those locations didn't represent Jasmine's movements. They represented Jason's movements. He had taken her phone from his apartment. He had kept it with him as he drove around the city. He was using it to send fake text messages to her family, carefully crafting responses designed to make them believe she was alive and fine. He sent the text about staying with a friend. He posted the old photo to Facebook with that generic caption. He responded to concerned messages from family members with short, vague replies that bought him time while he figured out what to do next. The phone records told investigators the whole story. They showed Jasmine's phone remaining in apartment 210 from the time she arrived just before midnight until approximately 3:30 a.m. They showed the phone leaving the apartment with Jason and moving to the locations he visited throughout November 23rd. They showed text messages being sent to Jasmine's family at times when Jason had possession of the phone. They showed the phone's activity patterns changing dramatically from how Jasmine normally used her device. And then, late that night, the phone went completely silent. Jason had removed the SIM card, severing the last digital connection between Jasmine and the world. By November 26th, 3 days after Jasmine disappeared, investigators had assembled a substantial portion of their case against Jason Chen, but they still needed to locate Jasmine's vehicle. The white Chevy Equinox had been missing since the night of November 22nd, and finding it could provide crucial additional evidence. Using the MyChevy app's vehicle tracking system, investigators and the Pace family working together located the SUV at Signal View Condominiums, several miles from Jason's apartment. When police arrived to examine the vehicle, they found something immediately suspicious. The driver's seat was pushed all the way back, positioned for someone much taller than Jasmine's 5'2" frame. Jasmine always kept the seat close to the pedals because that was the only way she could comfortably reach them and drive safely. There was no scenario in which she would have adjusted the seat that far back. Someone else had been driving her car, someone significantly taller, someone who had moved the seat to accommodate their longer legs. Surveillance footage from Signal View condominiums provided the visual confirmation investigators needed. Cameras captured someone wearing a white hoodie pulling up in Jasmine's Equinox on November 23rd, parking in the lot, getting out of the vehicle, and walking away toward a nearby road. The person's face wasn't fully visible under the hood, but their height, build, and gait matched Jason Chen. He had relocated Jasmine's car to create the illusion that she had driven somewhere on her own, that she had left his apartment alive and under her own power, that her disappearance had nothing to do with him. Every piece of evidence investigators gathered pointed in the same direction. Jasmine had gone to Jason's apartment on November 22nd. She had been killed there in the early morning hours of November 23rd. Jason had spent the day covering up what he had done, cleaning the apartment, disposing of evidence, moving her body, relocating her car, sending fake texts from her phone, and then he had fled. On November 29th, 2022, a week after Jasmine disappeared, police finally tracked Jason Chen to Nolensville, Tennessee, a small town about 2 hours north of Chattanooga. He had gone to his parents' house, returning to the place where he had grown up, seeking refuge while investigators closed in on him. Officers from the Nolensville Police Department, working in coordination with Chattanooga detectives who had issued a warrant for his arrest, arrived at the residence early in the morning. They found Jason inside the house, in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by familiar belongings from a life that had existed before November 22nd, before he made the choice that would end Jasmine's life and destroy his own future. When officers entered the room and told him he was under arrest, he didn't run, he didn't resist, he protest or claim innocence. He sat on his bed, looked at the officers, and simply nodded. It was as though he had been waiting for this moment, as though he knew it was inevitable, as though some part of him was relieved that the running was finally over. He had visible injuries on his hands and feet when officers examined him. Cuts, bruises, scrapes, marks consistent with someone who had been involved in a violent physical altercation. The injuries weren't the kind you get from defending yourself against an attacker. They were the kind you get from attacking someone else, from gripping a weapon, from struggling with a victim who is fighting for their life. His hands showed abrasions and cuts that medical examiners would later determine were consistent with repeatedly using a knife. When officers searched Jason's bedroom and his car, they found evidence that painted a disturbing picture of the days he had spent hiding at his parents' house. Handwritten notes scattered across his desk, loose sheets of paper filled with his careful handwriting. These weren't journal entries or random thoughts. These were drafts of a story he was creating, different versions of events he was trying to perfect. In his handwriting, investigators found claims that Jasmine was a runaway, that she had a troubled past that made her unpredictable, that she had left his apartment on her own and he didn't know where she went. Investigators also found Jasmine's SIM card in his possession, the tiny chip he had removed from her phone to prevent it from being tracked after he stopped using it to send fake messages. The SIM card represented physical evidence that he had taken her phone, that he had controlled her device, that he had been the one sending those texts to her family. And they found photographs on his phone, including images taken in his bathroom on the night Jasmine disappeared. Investigators didn't release the specific details of those photos to the public, but they were entered into evidence as proof that Jasmine had been in his apartment during the precise time frame when she was killed. Jason Chen was formally arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Officers read him his Miranda rights carefully, making sure he understood each word, making sure there would be no procedural issues that could jeopardize the case later. They handcuffed him and placed him in the back of a police car for transport to the Williamson County Jail, where he would be held until authorities could arrange his transfer to Chattanooga to face charges. During the ride to the station, Jason sat quietly, staring out the window at the familiar streets of his hometown passing by, streets he might never see as a free man again. Back at the jail, detectives attempted to interview him, hoping he might provide information about where he had taken Jasmine's body. but Jason invoked his right to an attorney immediately and refused to answer any questions. He sat in the interrogation room with his hands folded on the table in front of him, his mouth closed, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall, giving nothing away. But while police had their suspect in custody, while they had overwhelming evidence that he had killed Jasmine in his apartment, one devastating question remained unanswered. Where was Jasmine Pace? Where was her body? The evidence made it overwhelmingly clear that Jason had killed her and removed her remains from his apartment. Surveillance footage had captured him loading that heavy suitcase into his vehicle. Phone records showed him traveling to various locations around Chattanooga throughout November 23rd. But where had he taken her? Where had he left her daughter? Search teams organized by the Chattanooga Police Department began the systematic, heartbreaking work of combing through areas around the city, focusing specifically on locations Jason Chen's phone had pinged on November 23rd. They used cell phone tower data to identify places where he had stopped for extended periods, places remote enough that he could have disposed of a body without being observed. Volunteers from the community joined the official search efforts, walking through fields and wooded areas, checking along roadways, looking for anything out of place. Days passed. The search continued through all weather conditions, through rain and cold, through areas both accessible and difficult to navigate. Search dogs were brought in, trained animals that could detect human remains. Dive teams checked bodies of water. Helicopter crews conducted aerial surveys of remote locations. And all the while, the Pace family waited, existing in that terrible liminal space between hope and despair, knowing that finding Jasmine's body would bring them the closure of certainty, but would also confirm their worst fears in the most final way possible. Then, on December 1st, 2022, more than a week after Jasmine disappeared, law enforcement search teams focusing on Suck Creek Road made the discovery everyone had been dreading. Suck Creek Road is a quiet, isolated area near the Tennessee River, the kind of place where the trees grow thick and close, where the underbrush is dense enough to hide things, where you can be completely alone even in the middle of the day. Cell phone records had shown Jason's phone pinging towers in this area in the early morning hours of November 23rd, right around the time surveillance cameras had captured him loading that heavy suitcase into his vehicle. Search teams moved methodically through the area, walking in careful patterns, checking every section of the roadside thoroughly. The ground was covered with fallen leaves and natural debris that had accumulated over the autumn months, making it difficult to spot anything that didn't belong. But they kept searching, kept looking, kept hoping they would find the evidence that would bring Jasmine home to her family. And then one of the searchers saw it. Something that wasn't natural, wasn't part of the landscape. A large suitcase, partially hidden in the underbrush about 20 feet from the road, near the edge where the ground began to slope down toward the river. The suitcase was positioned in a way that suggested it had been thrown or pushed from the road rather than carried carefully down the slope. It was dirty, covered with leaves and debris, blending into the environment around it. The team stopped immediately. No one moved toward the suitcase. No one touched anything. This was a crime scene now, and contamination could jeopardize the entire case. They marked the location with tape and markers, established a perimeter around the area, and called for crime scene investigators to come handle the recovery. Within an hour, specialized teams arrived with cameras, evidence collection equipment, and the protocols necessary to process what they all knew they were about to find. Crime scene technicians photographed the suitcase from every angle, documenting its position, its condition, the surrounding terrain. They noted the trajectory it would have taken if thrown from the road. They collected trace evidence from the exterior, leaves, soil, anything that might provide additional information. And then, with careful, methodical movements, with cameras recording every moment, they opened the suitcase. Inside was Jasmine Pace. Her body had been forced into the confined space, folded and positioned in ways that were clearly not natural, compressed to make her fit into the luggage. She was wearing handcuffs on her wrists, the metal restraints locked in place. She had shackles on her ankles, additional restraints that had prevented her from running, from fighting effectively, from escaping. She had been completely immobilized during the attack, rendered helpless, denied even the most basic ability to defend herself. The image was devastating. This was how Jason Chen had disposed of her. Not with dignity. Not with any recognition of her humanity or the life she had lived. He had treated her like garbage to be discarded, like evidence to be hidden, like an inconvenience to be dealt with and forgotten. Investigators worked silently, professionally, doing their jobs with the respect that Jasmine deserved even as they processed one of the most heartbreaking crime scenes any of them had ever witnessed. The medical examiner was called to the scene to oversee the recovery of Jasmine's remains. Every step of the process was documented. Every detail was photographed and recorded. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was overlooked. They owed Jasmine thoroughness. They owed her family answers. They owed the case against Jason Chen the strongest possible evidence. Back in Chattanooga, Katrina and Travis Pace received the phone call they had been dreading since November 23rd. The call that every parent fears, the call that changes everything, the call that confirms that your worst nightmare is real and your child is never coming home. Their daughter had been found. Jasmine was gone. Not missing anymore. Not lost. Not possibly still alive somewhere if they just kept searching. Gone. Dead. Murdered. Thrown away in a suitcase and left in the woods like she didn't matter. The grief was immediate and total. It wasn't a gradual realization. It wasn't something they could prepare themselves for, even though they had known, logically, that this outcome was likely. It hit them all at once with crushing, suffocating force. Their daughter, their Jazzy, the girl they had watched grow up, the young woman who had survived so much and worked so hard to build a better life, was dead. And she had died violently, terribly, at the hands of someone she had trusted enough to visit in the middle of the night. The medical examiner's report made clear that this wasn't a momentary act of violence that spiraled out of control in seconds. This wasn't a single stab wound inflicted in the heat of an argument. This was prolonged. This was sustained. This was someone making the conscious choice, again and again and again, to drive a knife into another human being. 60 times. 60 separate decisions to inflict pain and injury. 60 moments when Jason Chen could have stopped and chose not to. The fake Facebook post was similarly analyzed. The photo was several years old, pulled from Jasmine's archived images. The caption was generic and impersonal, nothing like the way Jasmine typically wrote about herself or presented her life on social media. The post had been created and published at a time when Jason had Jasmine's phone, when her body was already dead in his apartment or had already been moved to Suck Creek Road. All of this, the physical evidence from the apartment, the surveillance footage, the phone records, the autopsy results, the digital forensics, came together to create an overwhelming, inescapable conclusion. Jason Chen had killed Jasmine Pace in his apartment on the night of November 22nd, going into the early morning of November 23rd, 2022. He had restrained her with handcuffs and shackles. He had stabbed her more than 60 times with a kitchen knife. He had cleaned the crime scene extensively, trying to remove all traces of blood and evidence. He had placed her body in a suitcase and driven it to Suck Creek Road, where he discarded it in the woods. He had taken her phone and used it to send fake messages to her family, creating a false narrative that she was alive and fine. He had relocated her car to make it appear she had left his apartment under her own power. And then he had fled to his parents' house, where he had spent days crafting a story to explain her disappearance. But who was Jason Chen before he became a murderer? Investigators began building a comprehensive profile to understand not just what he had done, but who he was and what might have motivated such extreme violence. On the surface, Jason appeared to be exactly the kind of young man parents hope their daughters will date. He came from a stable, middle-class family. His parents were educated, employed, involved in his life. He had grown up in a suburban environment with advantages and opportunities. By all outward appearances, he seemed normal, successful, on track for a promising future. But as detectives dug deeper, conducting interviews with people who had known Jason, examining his social media presence, reviewing his text messages and online communications, a more complex and troubling picture began to emerge. Jason and Jasmine had met on Bumble, the dating app, several months before her death. Their relationship had been casual at first, the way modern relationships often begin. A few dates, some text conversations, getting to know each other gradually. Investigators examining Jason's phone records and social media accounts found additional context for what had led to November 22nd. In the weeks before Jasmine's murder, Jason had been communicating with other women through dating apps and social media. He had been actively pursuing multiple romantic and sexual connections while simultaneously demanding complete loyalty and transparency from Jasmine. And there was evidence suggesting that Jasmine had discovered this hypocrisy, that she had found out about Jason's communications with other women. On the night of November 22nd, Jasmine went to his apartment. Investigators believe she went there to confront him, to have a conversation about his behavior, possibly to end the relationship permanently. Whatever conversation occurred between them in those hours before 2:11 a.m., when the neighbor heard screaming, it triggered something in Jason that transformed anxiety and fear into murderous rage. He made the decision to kill her, rather than face whatever consequences he imagined would come from letting her leave his apartment with the knowledge she had about his behavior. He chose violence. He chose murder. And he chose to continue inflicting that violence long past the point of necessity, long past the point where Jasmine posed any threat to him, long past the point where she could have told anyone anything. Jason Chen's trial began in January 2025, more than 2 years after Jasmine's death. The delay was typical for cases of this severity and complexity. Both the prosecution and defense needed time to prepare their cases, to analyze the extensive physical evidence, to review hundreds of hours of surveillance footage, to interview dozens of witnesses, to prepare expert testimony on forensic evidence, digital records, and medical findings. Pre-trial motions had to be filed and argued. Legal questions about admissibility of evidence had to be resolved. And through all of it, Jason sat in jail, held without bond, waiting for his day in court. When the trial finally began, the courtroom in Chattanooga was packed to capacity. Jasmine's family filled several rows of benches behind the prosecution table. Her mother Katrina, her father Travis, her extended family members, all of them dressed in their best clothes, all of them carrying photos of Jasmine to remind everyone that this case was about a real person, not just an abstract legal proceeding. Friends of Jasmine attended every day of the trial, wearing buttons with her photo, holding hands during difficult testimony, providing visible support for the Pace family. The prosecution team, led by experienced prosecutors from the Hamilton County District Attorney's Office, laid out their case with methodical precision. This wasn't a case that relied on a single piece of evidence or witness testimony. This was a case built on layers and layers of proof, each piece supporting and reinforcing the others, creating a narrative so complete and so thoroughly documented that it left no room for reasonable doubt. The verdict was unanimous on all counts. There had been no dissent, no long debates, no juror holding out for a lesser charge. They had looked at the evidence and reached the only conclusion the facts supported. The reading of the verdict brought immediate emotional reactions from Jasmine's family. Sentencing took place in a separate hearing. Under Tennessee law, first-degree murder carries either life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum sentence, or life in prison without any possibility of parole. The jury's guilty verdict had established Jason's culpability. Now the judge would determine his punishment. The judge acknowledged Jason's youth and the pain his family would endure, recognizing that there were no winners in this situation, that 2 families had been devastated by what happened on November 22, 2022. But the judge emphasized that the severity of the crime and the aggravating circumstances outweighed any mitigating factors. And then the judge delivered the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jason Chen would never be free again. He would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. There would be no parole hearings in 25 years, no chance to argue that he had been rehabilitated, no opportunity to convince a board that he deserved a second chance. The prison walls would be the last walls he would ever know as a free person. He would age there, he would grow old there, and he would die there. Katrina sat in the courtroom as the sentence was read, tears streaming down her face, Travis's arm around her shoulders. The sentence didn't bring Jasmine back. It didn't erase the horror of what had happened to her daughter. It didn't fill the hole left by Jasmine's absence or heal the wound that would never fully close. But it was justice. It was acknowledgement from the legal system that Jasmine's life had mattered, that her murder had been taken seriously, that her killer would pay the maximum price the law allowed. And it meant that Jason Chen would never hurt anyone else, would never take another daughter from another mother. Jasmine's story has resonated far beyond Chattanooga, becoming a case that true crime communities discuss, that domestic violence prevention organizations reference, that law enforcement uses in training about the importance of taking missing persons reports seriously, even when the missing person is a legal adult. The location pin has become particularly noteworthy, an example of how victims can sometimes help solve their own cases even in their final moments, and how paying attention to unusual communications can provide crucial clues. But for all the broader lessons and discussions that have emerged from this case, at its heart, this is a story about a young woman whose life was stolen from her by someone she trusted. It's a reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself obviously. Jason Chen wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a dating app match, a college student, someone who seemed normal enough on the surface that Jasmine felt comfortable going to his apartment alone at night. The threat came from someone she knew, someone she had a relationship with, someone who seemed like he fit into her world. That's the reality of violence against women that this case illustrates so tragically. Most women who are murdered are killed by someone they know, a current or former romantic partner, a date, someone in their social circle. The stranger danger that parents warn children about is statistically less common than the danger posed by people who seem safe, who have been let into someone's life, who are trusted enough to be alone with. Recognizing the warning signs of controlling, possessive, jealous behavior is crucial because those red flags often precede escalation into physical violence. If the last message you ever received from someone you love didn't feel right to you, would you trust that instinct? Would you push for answers even if people told you that you were overreacting? Would you refuse to accept easy explanations that didn't match what you knew about that person? Katrina Pace trusted her instincts from the beginning. She knew those texts didn't sound like Jasmine. She knew that Facebook post was wrong. She knew her daughter was in danger even when she couldn't prove it yet. And that knowledge, that maternal certainty, drove her to keep searching until the truth came out. And if someone you love goes missing, if they stop communicating in ways that feel normal to them, if the messages you receive don't sound like them, trust that knowledge. Push for answers. Document everything. Don't accept responses that minimize your concerns. Keep searching. Your persistence could make the difference between solving a case quickly and losing critical evidence. The Pace family's determination in those first crucial hours saved the investigation and ensured that justice would be served for Jasmine. If this case made you think, if it reminded you to pay attention to the people you love and to recognize warning signs in relationships, then it served its purpose. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this case. Share this video with people who need to hear this message. And remember, Jasmine Pace's life mattered. Her story matters, and we won't forget her.